In this video, we're going to revisit the stock market crash of 1929. Why should that be important to you? And believe me, it really should be. It's because, as Mark Twain is said to have said, but there's actually no proof that he actually said it, history never repeats, but it often rhymes. Now, I'm fond of saying history always repeats, but with little twists. And if you take a look into the past and you find something that had the same type of setup that society is at right now, where the fundamentals are the same, and then you look at what the outcome was, and then you try and see what the differences are, the little twists in the setup, you might be able, you've got a pretty good probability, actually, of predicting roughly what the outcome is going to be. And so the book that we're going to, this is cut. These things that I'm going to read were cut from my first book, Guide to Investing in Gold and Silver, and the original draft was called Understanding Money, and it was supposed to be a 3-volume set. This section is from Volume 1, Building Your Crystal Ball, and Building Your Crystal Ball was about trying your best to see what's coming in the future so that you can get prepared for it. And the best way to do that is look as far back into the past as possible and find every example that you can identify where something was happening that was similar and then what the outcomes were. And you add all of those things together and then you find out what those twists are, like I said, and you've got this good probability of predicting what's going to happen. Now, this was just Volume 1, and it took me a long, long time to write. And I got about a quarter of this Volume 1 done, and I was at 800 pages, and I realized that these 3 books were going to be like 9,000 pages or something like that only a few scholars would read for reference, and this wasn't a book that was going to sell to anybody. So I scrapped this idea and I condensed all of this writing and research, these 800 pages, into the first 50 pages of Guide to Investing in Gold and Silver. So I love this quote here. Predicting the future is never easy, especially when you attempt to do it in advance. And that's Bernard Baruch, and he was a very famous trader from the first half of the 20th century. And what I'm going to read for you here is from Chapter 20, Bumps, Dips, Bubbles, and Storms. It comes after World War I, the Weimar hyperinflation, and the bumps are the other hyperinflations that happened around the world. The dips are the big deflations that happened, including the Depression of 1921 in the United States and the Great Depression. The bubbles, there was obviously the stock market bubble of 27, 8, and 9. However, most people don't know that there was a nationwide real estate bubble in the United States that was at an extreme in Florida. That's where it was in a hyper bubble. And then the storms are the things like the the Depression of 1921, the Great Depression, the economic storms. But there was also a real storm. There was a hurricane that popped the Florida real estate bubble. And so I'm going to pick this up after there were a couple of pages where I'm describing all of the Roaring Twenties and the inflation that caused the Roaring Twenties, that caused all of these bubbles. And part of that was a very boring page on something called bankers' acceptances, which you don't really want to know about right now. But it's one of the ways that currency got created, and it was part of the great inflation of the 1920s. And to write this one chapter, Bumps, Dips, Bubbles, and Storms, I read more than a dozen books. I focused on 3 main books and probably 200 different websites or more. And I wanted to have a broad knowledge of all of the different economic understanding of what went on. And so I picked a Keynesian, Ben Bernanke's Essays on the Great Depression, his big thesis work that made him famous. And this is what was responsible for him becoming the head of the Federal Reserve for a couple of terms. His Essays on the Great Depression. So that's a Keynesian perspective. And what's interesting is because it's a Keynesian perspective, he ignored the great inflation of the 1920s. He ignored the roaring 20s, and he started after the stock market crash and after the economy had really gone through its full deflation. And that's the only way that a Keynesian could really justify his conclusions of what caused the Great Depression and how to get out of it. And then I read an Austrian school perspective by Murray Rothbard. Murray Rothbard's America's Great Depression. What's interesting, the title is America's Great Depression, and Murray Rothbard, being an Austrian economist, focuses on the big inflation of the 20s. So this whole book is really about the roaring 20s and the huge inflation, and then the stock market crash, and then the Federal Reserve and the government rushing in to save us and causing the Great Depression. And then he's done with it. He sort of wipes his hand out. He says, this is what caused the Great Depression. That's the conclusion of his book. And he doesn't tell you about the Great Depression very much at all because he's already proven his case. It was the Federal Reserve and the U.S. government that caused the Great Depression. And then for my third book, I selected something written by a monetarist, the dean of the Chicago School of Economics, Milton Friedman, with Anna Jacobson Schwartz. And it was a monetary history of the United States, 1867 to 1960. And this was a seminal work. Nobody to that date had ever taken on the task of writing such a thorough study of an economy over a certain period of time. And it just absolutely brilliant work. And Milton Friedman, when he was professor of economics at Chicago University, started what became known as the Chicago School of Economics, and it's monetarism. And so these three books I read, I'm dyslexic, and I read these before I found out that in all Macintosh computers, in the operating system, there's a text-to-speech. You just highlight text and you hit read to me, and it reads to you. You hit a button and it reads to you. So it took me months and months and months of reading these books, and I'd circle sentences and paragraphs. I'd hand them to my assistant. She'd type them up, and then I took all of the quotes out of these, and I took a whole bunch of quotes from other books and websites, and I wove them together into a timeline that gave me a really thorough outline that was very, very well researched of what went on. And Milton Friedman's book goes back to the Civil War. So you're talking Civil War to 1960. But more than half of that book was about the Great Depression and the cause of it. And his determination also that it was the Federal Reserve's fault and the U.S. government rushing in to save us. Those were the causes that turned what he said should have been just a garden variety to a severe recession that should have lasted 1 to 2 years at the most, and the government and the Federal Reserve turned that into the Great Depression. So he came to the same conclusion as Murray Rothbard came. Now, when I took these and I wove them all into a timeline like this, I then wrote over the top of them, and then I left a quote here and there. I've since cut out all of Ben Bernanke's quotes because he's just not quotable. He is a bad author. If you get a chance to read him, don't, because he's just going to give you a migraine headache that'll send you to bed for 2 days. It was a pain in the ass to read this book, and I guarantee you, I'm going to revisit these books, but I'm never going to read this one again. He's an awful author. So I'm picking this up after the banker's acceptances, and I'm just going to get into it, and I'm going to hit you with sort of a barrage of quotes, and I'm sorry for that, but it sort of gives you an idea of what was going on at the time, and I'm going to pick it up from the Roaring '20s, and then through the stock market crash, and then at the end of this, I'm going to give you some further analysis and bring it up to what's going on today. So you're going to really want to watch this through the end. I know it's sort of a long video, but I hope that it's entertaining for you. The 20s were, in the main, a period of high prosperity and stable economic growth. The bull market in stocks mirrored the soaring American optimism about the future. Milton Friedman and Anna Jacobson Schwartz. Now, I might just say Milton Friedman and in coming quotes, but I'm referring to both of them here. Anna Jacobsen Schwartz probably did all of the hefty lifting and wrote most of the monetary history of the United States under the direction of Milton Friedman, and I'll bet she was also she was probably the main researcher on this thing. So when I say Milton Friedman in the future here, I mean Milton Friedman and Anna Jacobsen Schwartz. It's just that it's a mouthful. It's sort of a tongue twister for me, and every once in a while I mess it up and have to redo it again and again. So President Coolidge and Secretary of Treasury Mellon acted as the leading capadores of Wall Street. Now, a capador is somebody in a bullfight that also had a cape besides the bullfighter, the matador. The capador was another person with a cape that would distract the bull, like especially during times when the matador is switching over to the sword, pulling out the sword, the death of the bull. The capador was the distraction. So the President Coolidge and the Secretary of the Treasury Mellon acted as the leading capadores of Wall Street, distracting the public from what was really going on. Optimistic statements by Mellon and Coolidge trumpeted the new era of permanent prosperity, repeatedly injected tonics into the market. Murray and Rothbard. One important aid to stock market inflation was the Federal Reserve policy of keeping call loan rates on bank loans to the stock market particularly low, Murray and Rothbard. Now, that's the same as margin accounts today. So margin currency is currency that is created by the brokerage house to loan you to buy stocks on margin. And so it is an expansion of the current, it's a type of inflation. So the high prosperity of the 20s and the spreading belief of a new era understandably led to an increasingly optimistic evaluation of the prospects of repayment and hence an increasing readiness to lend on a given project or collateral. One result of these developments was that they apparently led to a reduction in the average quality of credit outstanding, Milton Friedman and Anna Jacobsen Schwartz. Now, does that remind you of the real estate bubble that was happening in 2005, 6, and 7 when they would lend to anybody that could breathe? And we've had a reduction in credit quality outstanding recently before this coronavirus and market collapse. There was reduced credit quality outstanding. In fact, the United States, the U.S. Treasury bonds the United States suffered a downgrade of their credit rating. So this is something that is happening today. And so the outcomes are going to be somewhat similar. But in this outcome, you have to be ready for something really weird. It's not going to be like just the crash of 29. This is what it's going to be like at first. But then with the inflation that we're going to have with the world's central banks, it's going to be the most, I call it indeflation. You'll see more about that later, but it is going to be the weirdest, most twisted thing that you've ever seen coming at you, where it's just going to be hard to predict. And so the better your background is at knowing all these things, the better your chances of having a good outcome through this. But the music played and the boom went on. People danced the Charleston and the Lindy Hop live to radio performances by Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington. In speakeasies, they sipped bootleg booze supplied by the likes of Al Capone or Joe Kennedy from teacups. In 1927, Charles Lindbergh flew the Atlantic, and at the movies, which came of age at the beginning of the decade, silent films gave way to the talkies when Al Jolson sang in The Jazz Singer. The Dow began the year at 152 points and finished the year at 202, a 33% gain. Does that sound familiar? But it was mainly the rich who were getting richer. The wealthiest 1% of the population controlled the majority of the nation's wealth. The Tax Acts of 1921, 24, and 26 reduced taxes on the wealthiest individuals from over 75% to less than 25%, and inheritance tax was also cut. This helped fuel a booming stock market. Now that should just give you chills. That's exactly what has been going on over the past couple of decades here. The whole country was intoxicated. In 1928, newly elected President Herbert Hoover proclaimed, "We in America today are nearer the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of any land." Now there was a booming middle class who, because of the availability of easy credit, were able to afford cars, homes, and radios. Newspaper ads touted, "Own your own home for just $25 to $85 per month." The Dow had begun the year at 202 and finished the year at 300, a 50% gain. Many investors caught up in the race to make a killing invested their life savings, mortgaged their homes, and cashed in safer investments such as treasury bonds and bank accounts. Mark S. Underwood. The Securities and Exchange Commission did not yet control the stock market, so it was constantly being manipulated by the Wall Street elite. A bunch of very wealthy men who would pool their currency together, start buying up a stock, spread rumors that it was going to the moon, and dump the stock on the unsuspecting public. Now, this was written before I started differentiating before currency and money. So this was early 2005, and I was not, later on, I established like this hard line of what money is and what currency is, and I tried to make I tried to always define the difference and take a stand on making sure I wasn't miscommunicating or giving currency, suggesting that currency had attributes that it does not. And we don't use currency. We don't use money. We use currency all over the world. Money is gold and silver. Everything else is current fiat national currencies. So, on March 8th, 1929, Michael Meehan began one of the most successful pools on Wall Street. From March 8th to March 17th, Meehan and the pool pushed up the price of RCA stock. Now, RCA was like the Apple or Amazon or Facebook stock of the day. This was the tech stock. This was the leading stock, RCA, by almost 50%. And that's in just a few days there. On March 18th, they sold and divided up their profits. In today's currency, they had made $100 million for 1 week's work. If the small investors suffered, they'd soon be back for more. PBS, The American Experience, The Crash of '29. It's a racket. Those stock market guys are crooked. Al Capone. On May 23, 1929, the new Marx Brothers movie, The Coconuts, would premiere in New York. The subject was the gullibility of all the suckers that had bought property in the Florida land boom just a few years earlier. 800 wonderful residences will be built right here. Why, they're as good as up. Better. You can get any kind of home you want. You can even get stucco. Oh, how you can get stucco. Now is the time to buy while the new boom is on, and remember the old saying, a new boom sweeps clean. Groucho Marx, The Coconuts. Groucho put all of his earnings into the booming stock market, on margin, of course. I think I saw an interview with Groucho years ago that he really lost everything in the stock market, everything that he had made in all of those Marx Brothers films to that point, and had to start over. In August, brokerage houses were installed on transatlantic luxury liners so that the wealthy investor wouldn't go through stock market withdrawals during the week-long crossing. Secretary Mellon trumpeted once again about our unbroken and unbreakable prosperity, Murray N. Rothbard. But something wasn't quite right in the economy. Retail sales had slowed, and industrial production was falling. On Monday, September 3rd, 1929, the Dow hit a peak of 386 points, a gain of 22% in just 8 months. Everybody thought it was a new beginning. Very few could imagine it might be the beginning of the end. You know it's time to sell when the shoeshine boy gives you stock tips. Joseph Kennedy Sr. There were prophets of doom, but their warnings were drowned out by the wail of the saxophone and the ring of the cash register. Stuart Ross. Clearly, the greater the credit expansion and the longer it lasts, the longer the boom will last. Evidently, the longer the boom goes on, the more wasteful the errors committed, and the longer and more severe will be the necessary depression readjustment. Murray N. Rothbard. By Tuesday, October 22nd, The Dow had slid to 326 points. The next day, Yale University economist Irving Fisher would proclaim, "The nation is marching along a permanently high plateau of prosperity." Little did he know that on that very same day, investors would get spooked, and over the next few days, the slide would turn into an avalanche that would become the greatest stock market crash in history. The New York Times read, "Price of stocks crash in heavy liquidation. Total drop of paper loss $4 billion. 2,600,000 shares sold in the final hour in record decline. Many accounts wiped out." The next day would become known as Black Thursday. Worst stock market crash stemmed by banks. 12,894,000 share day swamps markets. Leaders confer, find conditions sound. The Dow had fallen 11% that morning, from 306 to 272. But at 1:30 p.m., Richard Whitney, vice president of the New York Stock Exchange and floor trader for J.P. Morgan, started buying. Fear evaporated, and the markets made a U-turn. The Dow rebounded and closed just a whisker under 300 points. But that was only a preview of the horrors yet to come. Black Monday. Stock prices slump $14 billion in nationwide stampede to unload. 16 leading issues down $2,893 million. Telephone and telegraph and steel among heaviest losers. Premier issues hit hard. Unexpected torrent of liquidation again rocks markets. On Black Monday, panic selling saw the Dow plummet 13% to 260 points. But unlike Black Thursday, no savior stepped in to stop the carnage. 500 miles from Wall Street in the Atlantic, the luxury liner, the Berengaria, was heading home. From Michael Meehan's brokerage office, word spread throughout the ship, "The bottom's falling out of the market." Men came running out of their Turkish baths in towels. Card games ended abruptly. Everyone tried to jam into the tiny office yelling, "Sell at market." They had left England, wealthy men. They docked in New York without a penny. The crash of 1929, the American experience, PBS. But it wasn't over yet. There is a reckoning that occurs every so often in world history. It is a time when debts are paid, when wars are fought, when disease ravages and passes through a land, when the corn does not grow like it used to, or when the forces of nature itself delivers a brief, catastrophic blow. On Black Tuesday, the reckoning of several years of boom, which was based in large part on credit, came due. R. Richard Saville. Boy, I wish I could write like him. The Dow would fall to 2012 before recovering to close at 230 points. The New York Times would read, "Stocks collapse in a 16,410,000 share day. 240 issues lose. 15,894 million in month. 240 stocks lost almost $16 billion in 1 month. It doesn't sound like a lot today, but let me put that into perspective for you. According to Milton Friedman and Anna Jacobson Schwartz, the U.S. currency supply in 1929 was about $48 billion. The losses for just these 240 stocks amounted to 1/3 of the currency supply of the United States. Most of the panic took place in the morning hours. The ticker tape machine fell behind by an hour and a half, leaving investors madly scrambling to sell their investments without even knowing the current prices. Panic set in. People gathered outside the exchanges and brokerage houses. Police were dispatched to ensure the peace. Rumors were flying. By 12:30 p.m., the Chicago and Buffalo exchanges were closed down. 11 well-known speculators had already killed themselves, and the New York Stock Exchange closed the visitors gallery on the wild scenes below, dust and woodward. Now, I don't know if there were really any suicides, but I do know that after a 2-day rally, the markets continued their slide. In an act unprecedented in its history, The Federal Reserve moved in during the week of the crash, the final week of October, and in that brief period added almost $300 million to the reserves of the nation's bank. Instead of going through a healthy and rapid liquidation of unsound positions, the economy was fated to be continually bolstered by governmental measures that could only prolong its diseased state. As a result, the weekly reporting member banks expanded their deposits during the fateful last week of October by $1.8 billion, a monetary expansion of nearly 10% in 1 week. The Federal Reserve also promptly and sharply lowered its rediscount rate. That would be like the Fed funds rate today. Murray Ann Rothbard. On November 13, 1929, the Dow bounced at 198 points and the markets began to recover. President Hoover would exclaim, "Any lack of confidence in the economic future or the basic strength of business in the United States is foolish." Investors rushed in to scoop up the bargains, and the markets continued to rise. By April of the following year, the Dow had risen 50% and was a breath away from 300 points. Then, on April 17th, with the Dow at 294 points, the markets began to falter. All of the currency that the Fed had manufactured had created a false bottom. Almost everyone believed that speculation could now be resumed in earnest. A common feature of all of these earlier troubles was that, having happened, they were over. The worst was reasonably recognized as such. The singular feature of the great crash of 1929 was that the worst continued to worsen. What one day looked like the end proved the next day to have only been the beginning. Nothing could have been more ingeniously designed to maximize the suffering and also to ensure that as few as possible escaped the common misfortune. The man with the smart money who was safely out of the stock market when the first crash came naturally went back in to pick up bargains. The bargains then suffered a ruinous fall. John Kenneth Galbraith, The Great Crash. I've heard it said that more currency was sucked into the markets during this rally by investors scrambling to pick up a deal than was lost during the crash of '29. But the carnage would continue for 2 more years when the Dow would finally find a real bottom on July 8, 1932, at just 40.56 points, a loss of 89%. It would take another quarter century for the Dow to exceed its 1929 peak. The terrible depression that followed was the direct result of bungling by the Federal Reserve System. Worse still, America's Great Depression was to become worldwide. Milton Friedman. Now, this is a chart of the crash, so all of this was about this crash, and then a little bit of it was about this recovery. And then just that last paragraph was about the rest of this slide into mid-1932. Now, when I wrote that it took a quarter century for the Dow to exceed its 1929 peak, since then, this was 2005 when all of this was written, and it took months and months and months of research to be able to write these few chapters here. But since then, I've made many, many charts of an inflation-adjusted Dow Jones Industrial Average as a proxy for the stock market. And this is the latest one, and it's inflation-adjusted and it's indexed. When you index it, it's a logarithmic chart, first of all, so it shows you the percentage change over time, not the change in points. The change in points is pretty meaningless. If something is at 100 and it goes to 200, a gain of 100 points, that is a 100% gain. If it's at 1,000 and it gains 100 points, that is a 10% gain. If it's at 10,000 and it gains 100 points, that's all. That 100 point, they're all 100 point gains, but that 100 point gain is only 1%. So measuring instead of a linear graph, which would show you the change in points linearly. This is a logarithmic graph that shows you the percentage change. And then we've done something called indexing here, where at the peak in 1929, we indexed that to a value of 100. And then this is the percentage change up and down above 100. 1,000 is 10 times 100, and 10 is 1/10 of 100. So it's a constant percentage change on this graph. But what's interesting to me is that, say you were 20 years old in 1929 and you had inherited a bunch of currency, somebody died, you inherited a fortune, and you plowed it all into the stock market at its peak in 1929. You had to wait for 63 years, and now you're 83 years old, an entire lifetime wasted waiting to get up to the same purchasing power. And this is adjusted by the CPI, which I like to call the CP lie, because ever since the 1980s, ever since the Reagan administration, and this is not a Republican thing or a Democratic thing, both parties do this. They're equally guilty here. This is just a political thing in general. But since the Reagan years, we have been fiddling with the CPI and doing things like hedonic adjustment. Hedonic adjustment is where they say, well, your $50,000 car that you just bought has airbags and anti-lock brakes and all of these other improvements and the smog devices and all of these safety improvements, crashworthiness and so on. So it actually costs you less than the $5,000 car that you bought back in 1970. The price of cars have been going down. That's hedonic adjustment, and this is true. This is what they say. And then another thing is replacement. They've been doing replacement. Somewhere in here during the Greenspan years, Alan Greenspan, they decided that roast beef, or the cut of top sirloin beef that they had been tracking since the 1950s, the change in price for a pound of top, either choice or prime top sirloin beef. I think it was choice top sirloin beef that they have been tracking since the 1950s. They decided, well, beef is getting too expensive, so people are going to eat chicken instead. And they substituted it with chicken breast. Now, there are reasons that they do this. And then there's somebody that recreates the original CPI. That's John Williams of Shadow Government Statistics, or shadowstats.com. And you can go there and see the original CPI and how high inflation of those original goods and services that they've been tracking for more than, for 75 years now or something like that. You can see the real price change of those things without hedonic adjustment and replacement. But the truth actually lies somewhere in the middle. But even if you did, if you picked the middle figure and tried to make the CP lie into the CP truth, the consumer price truth, you would probably see that the crash of 2008 took us back to below where the stock market, the value of the stock market, was actually below what it was in 1929. Now, we're going to do further analysis of this in future videos. I've got to end this video because it's getting really long. But we're going into this period that I call indeflation. Every dollar created has to go somewhere. And we have these huge deflationary forces that I have been predicting for years. Now everybody is predicting inflation. And so everybody has jumped on board just recently within the past couple of months here. Everybody has changed their mind. No, not inflation, deflation first. And that's what I've been saying since I wrote this back in 2005. And I've stuck to my guns. Deflation before big inflation or hyperinflation. That we go through this roller coaster crash. Inflation, reinflation after the crash of 2000. And then a deflationary dip. Inflation followed by a deflationary dip, followed by a reflation of the markets and stuff, followed by a real deflation and a real crash, and that's what we're in now. However, the response that the world's central banks are going to do, they're going to make this the hardest thing for you to navigate possible. Every dollar has to go somewhere, and there is an opportunity somewhere, and it's your job to try and find it. The best way you can find it is by paying attention to monetary history. So what we've got to do is sort of paste the crash of 29 and the Great Depression to something like the Weimar hyperinflation. You paste these two things together, and you might get an inkling of what we're going to go through with this deflationary crash and then a hyperinflationary depression. It's going to be difficult to navigate, so we've all got to buckle up and try our best. I want to thank you for watching this video. We'll see you next time.